So when we think about delinquency is really composed of two things, okay? So one is going to be regular criminal offenses that no matter who commits them are illegal. So they'd be illegal for adults or minors. And then there's another category that pertains only to juveniles called status offenses. And these are things that are only illegal because of their status as a juvenile. They include things like running away, truancy, and incorrigibility, all things that are not against the law if you're an adult. Now, in some states, youthful offenders can actually be held in custody in the juvenile system until they're 21. So juveniles do not go to criminal court, they go to juvenile court. They're not convicted of a crime. They're adjudicated a delinquent. We have a whole different set of terminology for them. So criminal court's for adult offenders and juvenile court is for minor offenders. Now, the age at which you are considered an adult offender varies by state. And in Massachusetts, for a long time, it was 17. And maybe in the last decade or so, it's been raised to 18. There's different rights in the juvenile system, and it's more focused on rehabilitation. So juveniles have a constitutional right to treatment. Now, you can be tried as an adult when you're a minor, and that process is a little bit different in every state. And again, we have a course on this if you'd like to learn more. So when we think about psychological diagnoses, two pretty common ones that we will see with offending are conduct disorder, okay? And that is a term that represents a group of behaviors characterized by habitual misconduct, misbehavior. It's kind of a crappy definition, and I should probably update this slide. Basically, you cannot diagnose a minor with psychopathy, but conduct disorder is a predecessor to psychopathy. And then there's antisocial behavior, which is serious habitual misbehavior, especially that involves directed harmful actions against others. So in terms of how common is juvenile delinquency, you can see some differences here between 2004 and 2013, which is still really dated data. But juvenile offending has been on the decline since the 90s, okay? So juveniles, as you can see, and you can see from even 2004 to 2013 that there was a steep drop-off, right? And so just like with all other crimes, right, we're going to see more property crimes than violent crimes, and amongst violent crimes, we're going to see fewer murders and fewer rapes than robberies and aggravated assaults. So aggravated assaults are going to be our most common violent crime, and larcenies are going to be our most common property crime. You can see here a little bit of a breakdown from 2007, again, dated information, but it's not going to be wildly different today. So you can see percents of arrests that involve juveniles, right? So you're going to see that the percentage is going to increase as the crime becomes more serious because we have less discretion with more serious crimes. I mean, you still have discretion, but, it's not going to bode well for you if you let a kid who set a fire go. So these crimes break down almost the exact same way as adult crimes do in terms of categories. We haven't really broken them down this way yet this semester, but crimes against people are generally violent crimes, crimes against property, drug offenses, public order offenses, and then as I mentioned, there's some crimes that can only be committed by juveniles. So you as an adult can run away. As long as you don't make it look like you were abducted, that's a crime. But if you just want to up and vanish, you can legally do so, okay? You don't have a curfew. You can skip school. You don't come to class here. I'm probably going to reach out. Someone from school might reach out. But, police aren't showing up at your door, okay? So as I mentioned, status offenses are handled in juvenile or family court, and they include things like we just said, running away, truancy. Incorrigibility is the interesting one, and curfew, okay? So incorrigibility is also sometimes referred to as a stubborn child. Probably not the way your mom called you stubborn as a kid growing up, but these are kids who their parents can't control them, okay? Usually what happens for status offenses, you're going to go through the court system, okay? But you're not going to be convicted of anything, right? You're not going to be adjudicated a delinquent. So in Massachusetts, what's usually filed is a CHINS, a child in need of services. PINs and MINs are the same thing. Person in need of services, minor in need of services, okay? Girls end up in the system a lot for things like incorrigibility and running away from home. And girls are 3 times as likely to be held for status offense as a boy. So we have a long history here of treating women who behave in what the larger society considers unladylike, treating them as offenders. Now, only a small percentage of juveniles are actually serious offenders, okay? So about 3 to 15% of serious offenses results in police contact, okay? Couple reasons for this. Number one, the police don't catch all crimes, right? A crime has to be detected and reported to the police for anything to happen, okay? Kids that are serious chronic offenders tend to commit a large portion of those offenses, so they're high in recidivism. They commit a wide variety of offenses, and this begins at an early age. So we're going to see things early on like having trouble in school, poor grades, poor social skills. And there's a series of studies, not a series, they don't go together. There's several studies, okay, that have looked at pathways through delinquency, okay, and they've looked at large cohorts or large groups of minors. So the Pittsburgh Youth Study found that most serious offenders reduce offending over time. Even like hardcore criminals will reduce their offending over time or change their offending over time. And that their offending can be reduced when they're monitored in the community after a short-term incarceration. Long-term incarceration is ineffective at reducing recidivism amongst young offenders. In fact, they're going to most likely become like socialized and prisonized into prison subcultures. Pathways to Delinquency found that substance abuse treatment was effective in reducing substance use and crime. Quite a bit of crime is connected to substance use, whether it's crimes that are actually about selling, trafficking, manufacturing, distributing drugs, or the fact that many people are under the influence when they commit crimes, or that they commit crimes to support a drug habit. Boys far outnumber girls in offending. This is true for minors and adults. Okay, boys and men are responsible for about 75% of crime, and women are responsible for about 25%. Girls, so when we talk about girls, we mean minors. Okay, girls are 30% of arrests, 18% of violent arrests, 38% of property arrests, and 45% of larceny arrests. Okay, boys and girls run away equally. Okay, but girls are more likely to run away from home because of victimization. Sexual abuse is a pathway into the system for women and young girls. Okay, a lot of young girls come to the attention of the system because they're running away from an unsafe home, and then they get in trouble for running away. Okay, and then they end up in the system. Now, on one hand, this isn't necessarily bad because they're often in families where they do need some sort of intervention, or they need to be removed from their home in some way, shape, or form. And girls often engage in crimes of survival. Okay, so a lot of older literature, and by older I mean not that old, okay, we'll refer to this as prostitution. Minors, however, cannot agree to be prostitutes. Minors cannot consent, okay? Minors, that's trafficking. It is illegal to have sex with minors. Now, the age at which we consider it, the age varies by state. So in Massachusetts, it's 16, but someone who's 17 or 18 also could not legally, we don't have legal sex work here in Massachusetts anyway, but they could not legally be considered prostitutes. That does not mean they are not arrested for prostitution, though, because they are, but they shouldn't be. 92% of female juvenile offenders have experienced some type of abuse. So I've worked with teenage girls more than teenage boys, and I've worked with hundreds of them over, several years. And I would say almost every single one of them has experienced some type of abuse, and many of them have experienced sexual abuse. I think of all the kids I worked with, one is coming to mind. It might really be 2, but one is coming to mind. Had parents who had their act together. That kid recovered much faster and better because home wasn't the source of the problem. Okay, she had been hurt by somebody outside of her family, and developed some negative coping skills and ended up in treatment for that. 35% of girls in the system had been stabbed at least once. You'll see this amongst boys too. I worked with boys that were in a diversion program, and the number of them that had stories about like guns and other things was kind of amazing in that, like, wow. Okay, so the girls study group tries to better understand girls' delinquency, right? This is one of those problems that I mentioned before, that so much research is done, so much of our body of research was done by men, okay? White men. So they're coming into it with their biases and their perspective, and most of their subjects are boys, okay? So we don't study women and girls as much as we should, okay? So girls' delinquency when they're violent, and by the way, some girls can be wretchedly violent. I have had a young woman threaten to get like her gang after me because I wouldn't give her deodorant, which, you know, seems reasonable. So when violence occurs, sometimes it's peer violence. Girls come to blows with each other. They're jockeying for status, maybe self-defense, maybe defending themselves against a bully, defending their reputation. There's violence within schools, right? So in some schools, I hope you all went to a school where it was like nice and safe. My schools that I went to were safe, but every day outside of my junior high, we cut through an elementary school to get home, and every day there was a fight. Not necessarily girls, but I did grow up with some girls who could throw hands. And then I grew up in Everett, and today in Everett, there's a lot of stuff going down. Like there's routinely violence in the high school. Fighting by girls in school can be, you know, beef with each other, beef with school, beef with the administrator, feeling hopeless. And schools adopted these zero tolerance policies a couple decades ago. Now, they have good intentions, right? We don't want to have any fighting. We don't want to have any drugs in school. Okay, no weapons, no drugs in school. But what it means is those things get defined pretty broadly, and the consequences are pretty serious. And they often result in kids being kicked out of school, which is then severing ties to, you know, pro-social peers. It's severing ties to adults who care about them, right? And they call this the school to prison pipeline, okay? Because as kids get kicked out of school, and if you Google this, you'll see some insane stories of, like, you know, a girl has ibuprofen with her. Her friend is like, I have a headache. Can I have some? And she gives her some. That's technically drugs, okay? And people are getting kicked out of school. Probably the dumbest story I ever saw, as in, like, who thought this was a good idea? Little boy, it's Halloween. They dress up in school. You guys probably remember these days. He's a fireman. He's got a rubber axe. School deems it a weapon and kicks him out of school. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was 5, I wasn't in charge of my clothes or what I did or where I went. My mom would have made my costume, sent me off to school with it. Also, it's a rubber axe. What is he going to do with it? That is not the intention of, like, the Gun-Free Schools Act. The intention is, please don't bring your guns and knives to school. Okay, but kids have been in trouble for things like X-Acto knives that they have for art, for a knife that they have, like, with their lunch. Okay, so those zero tolerance policies really leave administration in a bind. They kind of have no options but to suspend kids, to kick them out of school maybe, right? And then where does that leave those kids? Depending on the type of neighborhood you grow up in, right? Girls might become violent to protect themselves from being victimized, right? So I think I told you in the last chapter about how I had 2 young girls get in a fight with each other. That same girl who was from Southie, somebody once tapped her on the shoulder, and we were a program where staff were not supposed to touch, there was no hugging, there was no physical contact except for restraint. And she mistakenly tapped her on the shoulder, and the kid very reflexively turned around and put her up against a wall. And she stopped, and then they wanted to give her consequences for this behavior. However, for her, this was reflexive. And she did think about her behavior. As soon as she had that staff member up against the wall, she was like, oh crap, I shouldn't be doing this. Okay. But for some people, like, that is a mode of protection. This was during a summer in Southie where several kids too were also dying by suicide. There was a rash of suicides. That was a girl from Charlestown who put the staff member up against the wall. The girl from Southie that had been in the fight with her had come home and seen the body of someone who had died by suicide. There's also violence in the home, right? Girls are frequently fighting at home with parents more than boys do. They fight with their parents for a variety of reasons. Sometimes maybe they think their parents are too controlling. Maybe it's a reaction to some type of abuse, right? And some status offenses involve domestic disputes between a parent and a child, a parent and a sibling, a kid and a sibling. And in the past, those are things that would be treated as incorrigibility, right? And now they might be classified as an assault and result in an arrest. And technically they are assaults. So Terry Moffat has this theory that makes it sound like she has nothing to back it up. Terry Moffat came up with this theory. And she talks about two developmental tracks, okay? She talks about life course persistent offenders and adolescent limited offenders. And we've actually talked about this a little bit. I just didn't use these terms with you guys. So adolescent limited offenders are exactly what they sound like. They're kids whose offending is limited to their teen years. Begins in mid-adolescence and they age out. Okay, and that is rooted in biological and social changes that happen to our bodies as we go through puberty. Okay, if you broke the law as a teen, that was probably you. Life course persistent offenders also have individual traits that lead to offending behavior. They start younger and they continue into adulthood and they engage in more serious violent offending. Now, for a long time, childhood was like this concept that was like till you were 7, okay? And then like as soon as you were 7, you were treated like adults in terms of like offending and criminal justice, okay? As we have public education and education for everybody, we start to get this time period of adolescence, right? And now we have a time period that we call emerging adulthood. And this is where you guys are, okay? It's ages 18 to 25. 25 is when our prefrontal cortex is fully developed, and we don't like wake up on our 25th birthday and stop making dumb decisions, right? But this is sort of that time period in life where like you might still be relying on your parents. Maybe after college you move back home for a little while. You're struggling in adulthood. And I don't mean struggling in a negative way, like you're finding your footing in adulthood. Now that life course persistent offenders, that's much more likely to be followed by men than women. Women, again, don't offend anywhere near as much. Girls who do engage in serious problematic behavior usually start a little bit earlier. They're usually hanging out and spending time with boys who are a little bit older than them. And this is why we have to study men and women and not just men. Because risk factors are different for boys and girls. We know boys are sexually abused as well, and that obviously creates a variety of problems and is a risk factor for them, right? But for girls, it is an overwhelming number of women who end up in the system have been victims of sexual abuse and domestic violence, okay? Also, who are your friends, okay? Your delinquent peers are a very important factor in the onset of delinquency for girls, for all, but for girls in particular. Now, as teens, we kind of reach this peak logical reasoning around age 16, right? That's where our brain can kind of reason, but our maturity is far less developed. Those two paths, as I mentioned, right, they're going to merge around age 25. So you guys, your prefrontal cortex is also not fully developed. So teens know and understand, right, the risks and dangers of drinking and driving, but they literally cannot appreciate the consequences of their actions in the same way you can when your prefrontal cortex is fully developed. Now, I'm not saying, if you're 20 and you stab someone, you didn't know any better. Now, you know better. You know from when you're little, you don't stab people, right? We don't hit people. We learn we don't hit people when we're very little. We don't understand how serious or permanent, or we can't really empathize and feel what those consequences will be like, if that makes sense. Adolescence, young adulthood, that's a time of taking risks, being susceptible to our peers, trying drugs or alcohol, smoking, reckless driving, self-harming behavior, risky sexual behavior. And we are especially vulnerable when we're with our friends. Okay? In group delinquency, dumb stuff you do with your friends is generally not premeditated. Now, there's a lot of psychosocial contributors to this early onset of delinquency. Psychosocial just means social and psychological together, okay? If you end up working with kids, you might find yourself writing what's called a psychosocial report. If you take juvenile delinquency, that's usually an assignment I have in there. It's a great skill to develop. It might be something that you've learned in a human service, maybe in that interviewing and counseling techniques course. It might have been called something different, but it's basically like a history of someone that would be relevant to treatment. So how well do your parents monitor you? Again, this doesn't mean mom and dad follow you everywhere you go, but do mom and dad know where you are? Are they keeping tabs on you? Some things today that might be relevant to that is like your mom and dad have your location, right? So we didn't have this stuff when I was a kid, but I told you guys before that our parents, everyone had a house phone, and your parents knew who your friends were, and they knew who their parents were, and they would not hesitate to call and see if you were really where you were supposed to be, right? But today, in some ways, it's a little harder for you guys to sneak around because you've probably been sharing your location with your parents since you got a phone, since before you thought you might want to sneak around and not have them know where you are, right? Are there transitions in your family that are disruptive? This can be like mom has a lot of boyfriends. This can be stepdads. It can be a death of a parent. An inconsistent discipline, okay? So we know individual traits play a role in that life course persistent offending. We know that their offending starts sooner, and the key to that is the family environment, okay? So to come back to that idea I mentioned a few chapters ago, right, we used to talk about broken homes. It's not so much that your parents are not together. It's more, what does that mean? Okay. Now you can have two parents who are together who have terrible monitoring of their children and are not engaged with their children and are not loving and supportive of their children. Okay. You can have a single mom or a single dad who's really on top of their game and provides all the support that their kid needs. Okay. So it's really like broken homes is kind of like a symptom, right? And what's the underlying cause? We know that there's differences based on gender and aggression. Those are usually well in place by around age 5. This is a result of what are people's environments like? What's been reinforced, right? We are more coercive with boys. We encourage boys to be more physical. We tell boys to stop crying, right? Man up, stop crying. Don't be a baby, right? Girls were like, oh, honey, let it all out. She might not even be crying and upset, and we're like, it's okay, let it all out, right? Parents are also more controlling of girls' behavior. So, gentlemen, if you have a sister, ladies, if you have brothers, you might have seen some differences amongst who could be in your room and who could be in your house. And some of that's going to be based on age. I'm the oldest in my family. My brother, I have 2 brothers who are 10 years, I have 3 brothers. 2 are 10 years younger than me. When my brother was 16 and had a 15-year-old girlfriend, they were routinely in the house with no one there. And my mom said to me, well, they know they're only supposed to stay in the family room. And I was like, oh, I'm sure they follow that, Judy. That makes perfect sense. Okay. I was 23 and had an alcoholic beverage in my parents' house. And my mother was like, what do you think you're doing? And I was like, I graduated college and grad school and I'm having a drink in your home. No one's driving, and I'm of age. Okay, so some of it is parents get more lenient as you go further down the line, but we definitely treat boys and girls differently. Okay, boys and girls demonstrate strong preferences for same-gender children around age 3. Boys are facing more challenges, more non-compliance. We encourage a lot of rough and tumble play with boys, right? A lot of physical boys. Girls, we're encouraging a lot more cooperation, verbal exchange, compliance, mutual accommodation. So much of this that we think of as like, that's how boys do things and that's how girls do things is true, but it's because that's how we've socialized people, right? So girls, we don't see as much antisocial behavior when they're young. When it does appear, it's when they're teens and they're getting exposed to a wider variety of kids. Now remember, we've been talking about this callous unemotional trait, which is one of the traits that's kind of the hallmark of psychopathy, okay? So this goes beyond conduct disorder. So conduct disorder is sort of a predecessor of psychopathy, right? It's a lack of empathetic concern for others. You do not feel guilt. There's poverty of emotional expression. These are people who might say the right things, but you can kind of tell like the lights are on and no one's home. It feels shallow and flat. They generally don't fear punishment. So like threat of punishment doesn't keep them in line. And if you didn't feel guilty or empathy for others, you would almost always take the fastest, most efficient route to getting your needs met. And that would probably be aggression. Okay? These traits are common in kids with conduct disorder, okay? And they're common in psychopathy. Okay? They're also predictive of lifelong persistent offending. Now, sometimes that offending is like white-collar crime and it's not violent crime, but sometimes it's violent. And sometimes it's not criminal, but these are the kind of people that are just like, they'll step right on you to get ahead. Okay? They're terrible in relationships. Well, we have a class on psychopathy as well. Significant sustained reductions in these callous unemotional traits can be accomplished through sophisticated cognitive behavioral approaches. Okay, what does that mean? When we see things early, we can try to address them. You cannot fix psychopathy. Cannot fix it. There is no effective treatment. In fact, therapy makes it worse. You're teaching them how to empathize, and it teaches them how to manipulate people. They don't ever actually empathize. You're teaching them how to manipulate people. Okay, so what are our options here, right? How do we prevent juvenile delinquency? How do we treat juvenile delinquency and offending? And by the way, like juveniles are much easier to rehabilitate than adults, okay? And I've worked with a lot of juveniles. I'm in touch with some of them still today. They're all significantly older than you. And some of them do get better and like are out there living their best lives. Okay, so some strategies include things like mental health diagnoses. This helps us medication, therapy, services. Is there a substance use disorder? Okay, a lot of kids have substance use disorders as a result of using that as a coping mechanism. Now, few programs are effective. Part of this is because we don't run any of these things anywhere near long enough. If you're 12 by the time you come to the detention of the state and you've had 12 years of terrible coping mechanisms, I cannot fix that in a 1-year residential program. That's going to take a lot of work to undo. Also, what works for one person might not work for another, and we don't even have a good grasp on that. So I am still in touch with a kid. She's like 40. A client that I had in the past. When she finally turned her life around, I was like, hey, so what was different this time? And she doesn't know what was different. And I don't know what was different. And I've known her since she was 16. I don't know what happened. At some point, she was just ready to do the work. So how do we know programs that are effective start early, right? As soon as you start to see problematic behavior, you need to address it, okay? They follow these developmental principles and they focus on multiple settings and systems. One thing that's kind of sucks in the juvenile system, right, is that like if a kid gets in trouble, we can force that kid into treatment, right? But you can't make their family better. I worked with so many young girls where I was like, okay, let's use I statements and how can we talk to our mom about this? But their moms didn't have good coping skills. So the kid would go into it giving it their best, but mom's a hot mess. Right? What do you do about that? You're a minor. You can't just be like, F it, I'm moving across the country. I'm going to get another job and I'm just going to cut these toxic people out of my life. Like, you can't do that when you're a minor. We also want to acknowledge and respect people's cultural backgrounds, and we really want to focus on the family. Okay? So ideally, now, if social services is your route into, that's the system you're in, you can require those families to do family therapy. But I had to like basically break up family therapy before because, you know, a kid was under a desk. And by the way, the mom was not doing any better than the kid was doing. Also, mom or dad has to be ready to change. So primary prevention is universal prevention. Things we do across the board to try to make sure people don't become delinquents. Okay? It usually happens before like age 7 or 8. This is everything from prenatal care. Remember we talked in an earlier chapter about like proper nutrition and things like that. Your health insurance might provide like a nurse for you if you have a baby. Not a nurse like a nurse is going to come live with you. But a nurse who's going to show you like how to take care of the baby, how to change a diaper, right? This could be anything from like parenting programs, things like that. We want to help kids develop resilience, okay? Positive peer relations. This is why your parents cared so much. They didn't know this is why they cared so much, probably, but why your parents care so much about who your friends are, okay? Self-efficacy. Do we believe we can do things on our own through our own actions? Helping them develop their individual talents. Now, secondary prevention is going to target kids who are at high risk. They've got those ACEs. They're in a low-income community. So these could be programs like Head Start, right? So when I was growing up, I'm the firstborn child, okay? And my parents and grandparents, and I had 2 aunts that were like, one was 11 and one was like 15 when I was born. So people spent time with me. They read. They taught me how to read. Like, I learned how to do stuff before I went to school. Now, not every parent has that kind of time or energy or resources, but something like Head Start, which is like government funded preschool, can help get them like to that same playing field, right? I worked in a grant funded after school drop-in program. Okay, it was in Colorado. It was in it was in Aurora, in the 2 poorest middle schools in the city. Okay, and it was just a place where kids could go after school, so that like they weren't somewhere getting in trouble, right? And we had video games. We'd help you with your homework. You know, it's kind of like a boys and girls club. The more immersive, the better. Early detection and early intervention can prevent more serious habitual offending. So remember, we talked about how like genetics. So here's the analogy people use: genetics loads the gun, okay, and your environment pulls the trigger. Okay, so the sooner we can catch things, the better chance we have of preventing it from becoming a problem. Now, tertiary prevention is like, what do we do when people are offenders? And prevention is probably not even the best word because it's about preventing more offending. Okay, how do we reduce serious habitual offending? Okay, by adjudicated delinquents. Adjudicated delinquents would be like a convicted adult. Okay, we want to teach them. So, by the way, and different programs have different levels of success. I've worked in some programs that were pretty successful and some that were terrible. A lot of it, though, is about like cognitive behavioral therapy and helping people process, thinking about this concept called thinking errors, like how you misperceived a situation and then reacted poorly. What are your identifying triggers, learning what you can do, right? So you guys probably have figured this stuff out about yourself already, but probably not formally. You might be like, yeah, music really works for me when like in a mood. Like I put on my headphones and I block everyone out. Maybe you're someone who's like, I go for a walk, I paint, I do yoga. Whatever your things are that you do, right, that you know are helpful for you, that's stuff that we would help offenders figure out too, right? Again, what's most effective? Multi-systemic. You've got to have all the systems involved, intensive and long-lasting, okay? Rehabilitation takes time. You guys ever just tried to even break a habit you have, biting your fingernails, whatever it is, right? Or try to establish a new habit? Like, I'm sure you guys have tried to establish like gym goals at different points, right? I go to the gym regularly. I've been doing that for years. There are still days where I'm like, get your butt off the couch and go. I've never regretted going. I have regretted skipping it. But guys, sometimes it's hard to get yourself there, right? That's not breaking a bad habit. That's trying to start a good habit. Now, sometimes you're going to go into an institutional setting. This is what I worked in, a residential treatment facility, okay? The facility that I worked in, I've worked in a couple of different ones. They were locked from the outside, but not locked on the inside. So kids can't like push the door open and run away. There are also locked facilities. There are facilities that are essentially jail for kids. Okay, I worked in one of the best programs in the state for girls. Had a lot of therapy, a lot of even activities we planned for the kids, like recreational activities, had to have some kind of like pro-social. They were never just sitting around doing nothing. A lot of these kids, as I mentioned, physical abuse, neglect, sexual abuse. I met some of the most horrifying parents you'll ever meet in your life. Two parents I met that I'm sure to everyone else look like they are lovely people, but they are some of the most controlling people, and their poor kid cried after every family therapy session. Okay, a lot of these are not effective, okay, because they provide like the same therapy to everybody. Some of them just have crappy approaches. These jobs don't pay well. Now, these are jobs you can get while you're in college or when you're right out of college. And I do recommend them because you will learn so much. So much. It's a steep learning curve. You will learn it fast and you will learn a lot. Okay? But you can't stay in these jobs for a long time. I worked in a residential program for 4 years, and that's like most people are gone within a year. Okay? So they don't pay well. The hours are terrible. You will be physically assaulted. And, you know, in some ways it's kind of a thankless job. Now, it's not really thankless. If you can break the cycle for one kid, that's amazing, okay? And like I said, I know a couple kids that are doing really well. And that's awesome, okay? And it makes up for, like, every time a kid hit me or, you know, did something terrible. But, and by the way, that's not, like, it's expensive. These programs are expensive. I worked in one of these programs in the mid-90s, and it was hundreds of dollars a day. And it's not like that was going to staff. The biggest percentage of the money did go to salaries, and the salaries were not good. And you're working like 2 to 11. But you will learn a lot about human behavior. You will become really good at de-escalation. You become great in a crisis. It's really, really great skills to develop. But people don't stay in those jobs long because they're very, very stressful. We know that whenever we can be multi-systemic, that's going to be better. We want to focus on the family. We want it to be intensive. Okay, so you want like the kid in individual therapy. You want family therapy to be happening. That might be just mom and the kid. It could be both parents. It might include siblings. Okay, we need to like teach parents how to parent in these situations too, because like I said, of all the kids I worked with, I think I worked with 1 or 2. I can't even remember a second. I'm going to try to before I see you guys, but where the parents had their act together, okay? So multi-systemic therapy can be really helpful in terms of reducing defiance of authority, hostility, lying, temper tantrums, things like that. But it's a lot of work. And then you can do the same thing at the family level, intensive treatment within the family.